Hey, for the folks that just joined, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started in about a minute or so, but I'm really excited the folks are hopping on.
I'll be back.
Well, you gotta leave in 11.
Okay, great. Hey, y'all, I'm Erica Perry. I am Partnerships Director with Law for Black Lives, and we're so excited that you joined us for our abolition webinar. And so this is a webinar that we've put together in collaboration with Critical Resistance. So extremely grateful to be working with them, and also excited and grateful to our panelists for joining us for what we think will be a very meaningful and powerful conversation. And so just what we want to do today is just give a brief kind of like welcome, and then we'll get into a kind of overview of the prison industrial complex and prison industrial complex abolition. And then we'll hear from our panelists, and then we'll take questions from folks. So let's get started, y'all. And then again, as we're talking, feel free to like put questions, thoughts in the chat box. We want folks to be as engaged as possible. And so basically what we've been doing since we started the year is Law for Black Lives decided we wanted to start our year off with a series focused on grounding our members, folks we're in community with, on I'm sorry, y'all. If you can mute yourself, if you're not talking, that would be amazing. I think. All right. Cool. Thank y'all. Again, so yes, so Law for Black Lives, for folks who don't know, again, is a radical organization made up of attorneys, law students, and organizers. And so when we started our year out, we said we wanted to ground our members, who were both lawyers, legal workers, and organizers, in our work, in our politics. And so these politics are things that we see as foundational in our fight for Black liberation, and in our organizing work. And so first we started off with a conversation on Black queer feminism. This is our second in our series, and so this one is focused on abolition, and then we'll have another one that we're really excited about in April, focused on anti-capitalism. And so when we look at this, we know that abolition has been foundational for the fight for Black liberation, and something that organizers have been demanding for decades. And so what we hope to do is invite folks into a conversation with organizers and lawyers who we believe have been doing very meaningful and powerful work to kind of push forward the strategy around abolition. And so again, we want to make sure we focus on the foundational principles for this. So this would be both the introduction for folks who like, this is a newer concept for me. And also I think it would be a very meaningful conversation to learn about what it looks like to practice that as both the organizer and a lawyer when doing work that is often intertwined in the criminal legal system or in the legal system and policy. And so let's get started. So again, I'm Erica, and what I'm going to do now is pass it to Woods from Critical Resistance to give a bit of a background on who they are.
Hi, everyone. My name is Woods Irvin. I'm from Critical Resistance, and Critical Resistance is a 20-year-old national chapter-based organization that seeks to build an international movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. We do by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We believe that basic necessities such as food, shelter, and freedom what really make communities secure. And as such, our work is part of a global struggle against inequality and powerlessness. We know that the success of this work requires that it reflect communities most affected by the prison industrial complex. And because we are working to abolish the PIC, we cannot support any work that extends its life or scope. So that is critical resistance in a nutshell. We currently have active campaigns and project work to stop and close local jails. We work around shrinking the power of the police in a variety of cities to police communities. And we partner with lots of organizations such as Law for Black Lives to continue to develop abolitionist politics and practices.
Thank you so much, Woods. And so now what I'll do is introduce the panelists and then pass it back over to Woods to talk us through, like, kind of ground us in the framework and history. And before that, I just want to name that we hope that folks will participate in the conversation. You don't have to save your questions until the end. And so for folks who are on the computer, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll be sure to keep up with those as we're talking. So again, our first panelist that we're really excited about is Rachel Herzing, and she lives and works in Oakland County, California, where she fights the violence of policing and imprisonment. She is a co-founder of Critical Resistance, a national grassroots organization that we just heard about that's dedicated to abolishing the prison industrial complex. And she is also the co-director of the Storytelling and Organizing Project, which is a community resource sharing stories of interventions to interpersonal harm that do not rely on policing, imprisonment, or traditional social services. So thank you so much, Rachel, for being on with us. Always grateful to learn from you and be in spaces with you. Our next panelist is Woods Irvin, who we're really excited about. And they are a researcher in New York City at Barnard College's Interrupting Criminalization Institute. They are an organizer. Again, friends, thank you so much for joining us. Just make sure you get on mute if you're not talking. Woods is an organizer with Critical Resistance, an organization committed to abolishing the prison industrial complex. Woods is originally from Memphis, Tennessee, so shout out to the squad. I'm from Memphis also, by way of Oakland, California. While in Oakland, Woods organized with the Transgender Very Intersex Justice Project, an organization that works with currently and formerly incarcerated transgender people. So thank you so much, Woods, for joining us and for collaborating with us on this project. And our next panelist is Chris Henderson. Chris is a co-founder of Amistad Law Project, an organizer and attorney licensed to practice in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. They graduated from an institute in 2009. I'm going to pass it to you to say more about yourself, with a BS in chemical engineering, and from Temple Law School in 2012. They are a founding member of the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. And then thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. So excited again, always to learn from you and be in spaces with you. Our next panelist is Carrington Keys. Carrington Keys is one of 6 Black men known as the Dallas Six. They were inmates at the State Correctional Institution Dallas in Dallas, Pennsylvania. And as the Dallas Six, they blew the whistle on prison staff brutality and took nonviolent action to stop the abuse. After being incarcerated for over 19 years and spending a decade in solitary confinement, Carrington was released from prison on May 15, 2018, and Carrington is an organizer with Abolitionist Law Center in Pennsylvania. And so grateful, Carrington, to have you on the panel as well, and truly inspired by your work. What we're going to do is pass it now to Woods to kind of give us a framing and an introduction to prison industrial complex and prison industrial complex abolition.
Cool. First I'll do the definition of the prison industrial complex, which is, this is a definition that we at Critical Resistance use. And we see the prison industrial complex as, it's a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, imprisonment, and like other things like parole and electronic monitoring as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. I think there are three sort of big takeaways that we at Critical Resistance like to bring to the table when introducing the prison industrial complex, which is one, the prison industrial complex is not just prisons. And so while we want to see the end of imprisonment, CR is working to abolish all of the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is not broken. It in fact works perfectly to do what it's meant to do: cage, control, kill, immobilize, displace, and exploit people. And as this will transition me into talking about abolition, prison industrial complex abolition is both an ideology and a practice. So now how we define prison industrial complex abolition is as a political vision with the goal of eliminating prisons, policing, and surveillance, and et cetera, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. And so we put abolition into action through our organizational structure, our projects, and our campaigns. And we use the frame dismantle, change, build, which I have on my sweater here. I don't know if you can see it. And like to help us think about how we can keep all the elements of the fight against the PIC in focus while taking concrete steps every day to make abolition a reality. So that is sort of a broad sweeping overview of how we define the prison industrial complex, but I think part of the work that we're going to do as part of this call, we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into the fights against the PIC and for PIC abolition, and how specifically attorneys can be part of that struggle. So now I'll hand it back over to Erica.
Thank you so much for that, Woods. Appreciate that grounding. So now we want to get into the panel, and we'll start with Rachel. And so our questions, like, and I'll give multiple questions at a time, so sorry for that. It's one, just like, what do you mean by abolition? And what are the political and philosophical tenets of abolition for you? And then if you could talk a bit about some examples of movements working for abolition. Is the first kind of series of questions I have for you.
Cool, thanks, Erica. Some of you have probably heard me talk about this stuff on previous webinars, and so I'm sorry if that's repetition for you all, but hopefully it's repetition that helps things stick better and not just repetition that bores you to tears. So I'll try to keep it moving. The way that I think about abolition, I would say, is pretty similar to what was described, in part because I helped craft those definitions. So I'll try not to be so redundant there. But a few things. When I talk about abolition, I am always talking about prison industrial complex abolition. I actually think it's important to be clear and rigorous about what we mean, and not just say abolition as if that's meaningful in and of itself. And, just to reiterate what Woods was talking about, to my mind, prison industrial complex is about the elimination of surveillance, policing, sentencing, imprisonment, and similar institutions, systems, policies, and practices that have containment, control, and death as their aims. And that's it. That's what abolition is, right? To advocate for a prison industrial complex in a responsible way also encourages us to think about envisioning what we want to create the conditions for abolition to be possible. So what's also our affirmative vision? So to my mind, Abolition is about the elimination of those things, but to practice abolition, I think, requires us also to have an affirmative vision of the kinds of worlds that we want to fight for. So we have kind of goals or benchmarks to set for ourselves in terms of moving ahead. I mean abolition of all of the parts of the prison industrial complex when I talk about abolition. So, you know, to go back to what Woods was talking about, all of these various parts that make up this kind of complex, which is the most important part, right, of that phrase. Some people, for instance, can imagine getting rid of prisons, but they can't imagine abolishing policing or courts, right? Some people are interested in abolishing sex work or abolishing drugs, right? Those abolitionists frequently rely on the prison industrial complex to criminalize people who purchase sexual services or drugs. So back to my point about like just saying I'm an abolitionist doesn't necessarily mean a single thing to all people. So I think it's really important to be clear, not just in saying it out loud, but be clear in terms of like, what is the goal, right? So in saying that, I guess people have probably heard me say this a lot, but I think this is the big winner for me, big winner concept. What is your end game? What are you ultimately trying to do, right? So if you're trying to think about making immediate relief, and that's the end, is like stuff's really, really bad for communities that are policed or communities that are heavily surveilled or communities that are criminalized and put in cages, and relief from those systems is the main thing, then that's probably not an abolitionist end, right? If you believe that prisons are bad, but you think they're all right for R. Kelly or Michael Jackson or Donald Trump, then you're probably not an abolitionist. I would say you're definitely not an abolitionist, right? And that doesn't mean you can't be mad at R. Kelly or Donald Trump. You know, you can be mad, and you could think that they should have some kind of consequences for the kind of harm they cause. I also think it's irresponsible to presume that abolitionists don't believe in consequences, that it's like either you're for prison or you don't believe that there should be any responses to harm that happens. I just don't think that's true. I think good abolitionists, principled abolitionists, do believe in consequences, but we don't believe that coercive control and containment are the best responses, right? People tend to believe that transformational practices, practices that transform people's individual behavior, but also that transform the conditions that we all live in, are more appropriate than containment and control. So the end game matters. If you're aiming only for relief, or you're aiming only for, and relief is important, right? But if you're aiming only for that, and if you achieve that, everything's good to go. Or if you're aiming for efficiency, right? Like the systems that we have to navigate are really hard to navigate, and sometimes tweaks to them to make them easier to navigate would be good, but doesn't necessarily make them less coercive. So if we get them to run better, and that's the end game, that's also not what we're talking about when we're talking about abolition. In terms of the politics and what's rooted in them, I think, prison industrial complex, to my mind, is rooted in collective freedom and not individualism or lifestyle choices. So making an individual choice to not call the cops is a good start, but a prison industrial complex abolitionist politic has systemic change as its goal. So not just I don't call the cops, but I'm also encouraging my neighbors or my coworkers or my family or my friends to be confident and resourced to do the same, so that we're making systemic changes, not kind of individual lifestyle changes. Excuse me. The term is resonant with the abolition of slavery and has some roots that go back there, and we draw lessons from the movement to abolish chattel slavery. But I also think it's really important for us to be careful not to suggest that there's a direct through line from slavery to prison. I think calling prison the new slavery is not very rigorous, and I would encourage us to be more rigorous in saying that. Similarly, I think oversimplified analysis that boils everything down to the 13th Amendment is not rigorous enough either. We have different challenges in fighting the prison industrial complex. And our fights need to reflect the differences. They have to have a different character, and they have to reflect the differences in the targets and the things that we're trying to shift in the present day. What else? The contemporary movement for prison industrial complex abolition is also rooted in W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of abolition democracy. And, the idea that participation in a range of democratic institutions that ensure meaningful participation in new social, economic, political arrangements is really necessary for the viability of abolitionist aims. So that it's not sufficient just to eliminate imprisonment, for instance, but that there has to be a transformation in how people are engaged. People who would be imprisoned otherwise are engaged in the institutions, in the social, political, economic arrangements of our societies. One other thing I want to mention that I think is important is that I learned, and many people have learned, prison industrial complex abolition politics from Black women, particularly Black women and Black feminists. And sometimes this political ideology gets falsely described as white academic politics, and that makes invisible the really serious years of organizing and the really serious intellectual work that Black women organizers and activists especially have done to build these politics up. So please don't do that. Please don't say it's white or it's academic. It comes out of people's struggles, and we honor our antecedents, our Black women antecedents, when we give them credit for their work. I'm trying to think. You ended, those were the ones that you asked just now. Is that right, Erica? Did I answer them all?
You did. Thank you so much. And I think you spoke about affirmative vision and benchmarks. I wonder if you could go a bit deeper there and talk a bit about what the vision is and what the benchmarks are, right, for that vision. And I think the second question we have as the second question after that would be like just some examples of more conventional and mainstream reforms versus abolitionist reforms. And so what are some actual like reforms or work that we see that we won't have to dig ourselves out of later? Okay. And how we can tell the difference. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm going to use the language of abolitionist steps. I like that. First, to talk about abolitionist reforms. Some people use the term non-reformist reform, and no disrespect to Andre Gross, who's, that's his phrase. But I find that a little overly complicated. And again, I like to think in the affirmative. What do we actually want? What are the steps we need to take to achieve our vision? And I think what we want to do in imagining how to establish steps for ourselves is to think about what we ultimately want, which is, again, why I always return to this kind of like, what's your end game? What are you actually trying to do in the longest term vision of your work? And what's the kind of end non-negotiable, right? So if we don't want there to be imprisonment, we don't want there to be policing, then anything that we do in the short or medium term can't undermine our ability to get that, but has to augment our ability to get that. And that's not just abolitionists, that's like good organizing, right? So that's, sometimes we get offered ideas of, what's practical. We're told that abolition isn't practical. We're told you should be practical. This is a win that you can get right now. And to use that metaphor of low-hanging fruit that people sometimes use, which I'm not opposed to, is like we want to get stuff that's easily gettable, right? So we're not always overshooting to go for the biggest, hardest fight that doesn't keep people in organizing spaces. You have to figure out how you can build mass while getting more and more and more of what you want, right? So we want to get the lowest hanging fruit that's not going to poison us, right? We don't want to take something that's right in front of us if it's just going to kill us. So what we want is to think about what is achievable, and that also gets us, if we're using the fruit metaphor, what's going to give us fuel for tomorrow's fight rather than wind us all lying up
underneath the tree dead, okay? So some of those things to think about are what take away tools, power, resources from the systems that we describe within the prison industrial complex, right? So some of those things might be financial resources. They might be physical resources like land or actual cages. They might be human beings, right? So if we can keep human beings out of cages, then they don't have the raw materials to use to keep fueling that stuff. So those are things that we should be thinking about, is like, how can we starve the system in every way possible? Another thing that I often think about is kind of, you know, helping us establish benchmarks is also what delegitimates the prison industrial complex as much as possible, right? So what takes it out of being naturalized, which it has become so much in our society, to reminding us that these are not natural features of our landscape prisons, that it's not kind of some natural phenomenon that cops are on our streets, but that those are systems and institutions that get established and then have to be maintained. So those are a couple like guides, you know, what takes everything away as much as possible from it, from the system, and what takes away its legitimacy or its ability to be naturalized or commonsensical, right? What takes away its common sense. And a couple ways to do that, I think, are decarceration, right? So getting people out of prison, out of jail, out of detention is always a good thing as far as I can tell, right? So we do that so that more and more and more people are living outside of cages, which is just good, and it makes it, starves the prison of its human resources. It also potentially creates more people on the outside to fight. But the fewer people that are locked up, and anybody who's recently fought a jail, and I know there are some people on this call who have done it recently, can tell you that the fewer people that are locked up in a jail, for instance, the harder it is to say, well, this thing has to exist. It's really, really a necessary thing. And so it also is helpful, I think, in those kind of delegitimizing moments as well. But we also need to figure out, I said I think it's always good, and it is always good for people to live outside of cages. But I also think, you know, some of the ways that we do that can inadvertently set other people up. So if, for instance, there are laws or policies that get advocated for that allow whole sections of a prison or jail population to be released, but they do it by saying, these people are not like all those other really bad people in a prison. Those are the people who this thing really needs to exist for. And you should be afraid of them, and they should be behind bars. But all of these people are not them, right? And that could be so-called nonviolent people, right? That could be so-called first-time offenders. That could be so-called immigrants who are not criminals, right? There's all kinds of ways that the state and the state's institutions and systems tell us that we should pit different categories of people in its control against each other, and that we should do that to get certain people out. That is, I would say, an example of a reform that is something we have to tear down later, right? Because if then we have to go back and make a case to say, well, we didn't mean it the first time. We didn't really mean that these are the worst of the worst and that they really have to be behind bars. We've kind of undone our ability to make that case when we said that in the first place. So we want to do that. We want to get people out of cages, but we also want to do that in a way that it creates as much room to keep pushing the boundaries as possible. We want to get people out in such a way that we can come back again and say, remember that first bunch of people we got out? Well, now this other bunch of people also has to come out, and keep doing that and doing that until the cells are all empty. Excuse me. Some of the other kind of, you know, other kinds of steps, reforms that aren't necessarily abolitionist steps, but I think can be used for abolitionist aims, are fights to eliminate certain kinds of imprisonment. And this is similar, I think, to decarceration in some ways, because it removes tools. And we want to aim for the big tools, the biggest chunks to take out of the system as possible, the ones that give us the most possibility of destabilizing the system and the best chance of kind of being able to come back at them again. And eliminating certain kinds of imprisonment, I think, is one of those ways, right? So for the past 50 plus years, actually ever since the beginning of the initial penitentiaries, there have been campaigns to close down or eliminate the use of solitary confinement, for instance, right? So campaigns to close down prisons that are primarily solitary confinement cells, portions of prisons that are meant for solitary confinement, segregated housing, however people describe it, where they live. And then, you know, different scales to eliminate the use of solitary confinement at all, right? So there's nothing that automatically makes this an abolitionist aim, right? It doesn't eliminate the use of imprisonment altogether. It doesn't close down every prison, but it is a big chunk of what is used to discipline inside of prisons, and especially to discipline imprisoned organizers. And so eliminating the use of it, one, restores the humanity of imprisoned people, which allows imprisoned people to fight more rigorously in their own defense and against the systems that hold them. And we know that solitary confinement in particular does real damage to people's mental health. So we want people to be in the best fighting form possible to have the best chance of joining the fight from the inside out. But as I was saying earlier, it's also really used as punishment inside of punishment a lot of times. So it's used for organizers inside of prisons, imprisoned organizers who fight for changes to conditions of confinement or changes in visitation, or want to advocate on behalf of individual imprisoned people around their cases, that kind of thing. And it's used as a penalty a lot of times for people who are, you know, creating too much havoc of the kind of agitational sort inside. The prison will say it's for really, really dangerous people, but we know from watching the patterns of it that it's meant for political people, right? Dangerous of a different sort. And so, again, I think that for all of these things that I'm going to talk about, it's the way of doing it, right? So abolition, I think, is an endgame. I want to see the elimination of all of these things, but it's also a methodology or a practice, right? It's how you fight. So you fight with that long-term vision in mind. So as I was saying, there's nothing that automatically makes decarceration or automatically makes the elimination of one type of imprisonment an abolitionist fight. But I think if you do it in such a way as the goal is to really take a chunk out of the prison's ability to be its most punitive, while expanding the vitality and the number of people who can be engaged in the fight, then I think you're trying to take a bigger chunk out and create a bigger pathway for yourself. And it does that illegitimacy thing, right? If you don't need this thing, what else can you incrementally chip away at that the prison also doesn't need until it doesn't need any cages? Starving prison and police budgets is another thing that we've seen increasingly happening across the United States. You know, so there's the frame of invest, divest. And then again, here, that's not abolitionist in and of itself, right? But what you're advocating investing in, what you're advocating divesting from, can make it more in service of these long-term goals that we've been talking about. So if you say, you know, no police department in the United States should have more than, I'm making this up, 25% of all money for a municipality or a county, that still gives 25% of the budget to the cops, but that would be about a half slash of current budgets for most police departments in major cities in the United States, right? So right now, most police departments take about 50% of the general fund of cities. So the kinds of abolitionist steps or reforms that move you toward taking those tools, taking those resources away in meaningful ways, and then not just saying, we're going to put them into so-called alternatives, but what alternatives? What do we actually need to move the affirmative vision we have ahead? And here's why having an affirmative vision is actually really crucial. So if that means you need to open up all of the libraries that the city has closed over the past year, as well as buying more shit for police departments, or if that means actually providing decent working conditions for educators, right? So that teachers can make a living wage. They're not paying for stuff out of pocket. There are counselors in schools. There are medical professionals in schools. There's after school programming. There's arts programming, right? If all of those things that we know help people stay out of the hands of the cops, which by extension help you stay out of the hands of the courts and out of the hands of prisons, then we need to be thinking about where we want to put money and who should be managing it, who gets to have a say. And then the last thing I would say is, I think there are some abolitionist gains that are made through lawyering and having lawyers partner with grassroots organizing. And I think, Woods, you're going to talk more about that in a little bit, so I won't go too deeply into that. But I think, it's important to not cut ourselves off from the pretty broad range of tools that are available to us because we don't think they're abolitionist enough, right? So if we think about how we want to use the tools, like I was just saying, if we imagine it, this is a methodology as much as an end game, then we think about how do we use the law to create openings for us to get more than we had yesterday, and for us to take away as much as possible from the criminalizing system. And just one example of that is that here in the state of California, where I live, grassroots campaigning coupled with a series of environmental lawsuits helped put the brakes on prison building, prison construction in this state. And this is a state that the 20 years previous before these lawsuits happened in conjunction with the organizing had been building on average one prison a year for 20 years. And I think to date, it's like just 1 or 2 prisons have been built in the state. And so that's a big change. And that happened because of joint effort using legal and organizing strategy together. So I guess the one thing I also want to just mention is that we usually don't win pure victories, right? And I think if we manage to eliminate a huge policing tool like gang injunctions or like SWAT training programs, those are big wins. And we need to acknowledge them as big wins, but they don't eliminate policing altogether, right? That doesn't mean that they're not wins. It doesn't mean that they're not important. What it means is that we are in a protracted struggle and we need to plan for the long haul and we need to go after the next chunk. That is the step toward the long-term goal. So I think we need to not be overly rigid about thinking about what we mean by abolition. We have to use the politics in a way that bring people to it, that make it irresistible. We can't be pure or rigid about it. We can't make our own selves into the abolitionist police, right? To say, well, that's not abolitionist enough, or that doesn't meet the standard, right? It's like, how are we doing that? And what are we trying to get to, right? And at the other side of that, I think we also can't, we don't want to claim things as victories that aren't really victories, but I think we also don't want to not give ourselves credit for the good work that we do that, isn't 100% nobody is locked in a cage or has to have any more contact with the cops. We have to understand it as part of a protracted struggle.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Rachel. That was so rich and like so many like wonderful takeaways and I think meaningful takeaways. I think especially for folks who like find themselves as like lawyers on the front line and like organizers who are engaged in like these fights every day, where it's like trying to make sure we are not like compromising or setting ourselves up to have to come back and like fight something later. And so the next question is for you, Woods. And I think when Rachel spoke a bit about that the role of lawyers, some of the role of lawyers in this work is to create openings for organizers to like move forward. And I think for you, the question is, what does abolitionist legal work look like for you or that you've seen? What does that look like in coordination with on-the-ground organizing?
Sure. So I can give two examples, and of what it looked like in my experience. And that looks like in California, there was a campaign to stop gang injunctions, as Rachel was mentioning earlier. And gang injunctions are a civil court order that list a group of people and leave spaces for John Does as gang affiliated, and essentially does this work of criminalize, like adds an extra layer of criminalization to those particular people's lives, as well as serving to criminalize the entire community in which they're part of. And so part of the work that we undertook to fight the gang injunctions, and starting in 2010, there were attorneys that were part of the coalition pretty early on. And because of the necessity of moving through the courts, the coalition was forced to defend individuals specifically, but even so, we didn't throw anyone under the bus based on any innocent claims, both as part of our organizing outside in the media work that we were doing, as well as in coordination with the attorneys that were defending folks who were on the injunction list. And we used grassroots and legal strategies that were constantly working in concert with one another, though not always explicitly or publicly. And like one super, I think, concrete way is that the coalition, we would use the court dates that we would use specific court dates as a time to rally and build community and media presence as part of the propelling the pressure and the fight against the gang injunctions in the public forum forward. And so this consistent presence offered not only support to the defendants, it let the judge know that he was being monitored, and it started to shift the terrain that we were organizing on, and helped to influence the city council members who were going to who we were targeting to pressure the city attorney to stop the injunctions. Another instance, Rachel also talked about the solitary confinement, and in 2011 and 2013, there were hunger strikes across the state of California with the call challenging solitary confinement. And part of that organizing, that critical resistance was deep in. That included collaboration with attorneys as part of prison visits, attorneys sharing information with organizers to inform strategy, which is was really important given that the key organizers on the inside are already in isolation 22 hours of the day. And then once the hunger strike begins, there's even more repression and monitoring. So the attorneys were really crucial there, and in helping to coordinate organizing on the outside with organizers. There is the use of statewide hearings that amplified, it was able to amplify the voices of people who were in solitary, and bring solitary from something that California didn't even say that it used into the light and under scrutiny. Ultimately, there is a lawsuit, Ashker versus Brown, that was filed in May 2012. So similarly to the similar to the lawsuit that Rachel was talking about, there's the lawsuit filed in 2012 was to end indeterminate solitary confinement in the state of California. And after the strikes, the lawsuit kept moving forward, and this reached a settlement in September of 2015. And so we ultimately were able to win. And there's still monitoring going on, but I think that towards the point of what Rachel was saying, that's a huge victory. So those are two, I think, really, really salient, concrete examples of attorneys being intertwined with organizers as part of abolitionist campaigns that made really, really huge victories happen.
Thank you so much for those examples. And just when I hear about those examples, I wonder about just what, if you could talk about, based off of those examples and other work you've done with lawyers, what are some like best practices or values that like lawyers can embody to make sure that they're working well with the organizers? And I think we'll ask Chris to talk a bit more about it too. But what we often know is that lawyers are like invested in the system, both by like training and through conditioning. So I just wonder if you could talk a bit about what the values and kind of best practices folks could embody in working with organizers towards this like strategy and this methodology. Yeah.
Sure. I'll keep it brief because I know that Chris is gonna get more in depth in it. I can tell you that what it does not look like is that start there is that attorneys that aren't willing to take into account the movements of organizers as they're focusing on specific clients. It can, and then also prioritizing, when attorneys prioritize winning via solely legal strategy over the strategies of organizers. So not being in communication or in concert with, and not really taking the lead from the communities most impacted. And it can look like in policy working and look like pushing a policy in the legislature that's much more narrow than what could work when there's strong inside-outside organizing happening. So if the attorneys are pushing forward or lobbying around something that really is super constrained because of the win, when more robust pressure that potentially organizers are moving could be utilized for a more expansive gain. That's counter to abolitionist principle or practice. And then, I think that attorneys can, focus on what they know will succeed, as opposed to demanding something more expansive and what we really want when in negotiating. So those are kind of the like don't do's. I think that the do's are kind of like the opposite to that, but I think that what I like to what can share is organizationally, we like harkening back to what Rachel was also saying about thinking about abolitionist steps, we use a series of 7 steps to think about how we pull together campaigns in critical resistance. And I think that to some degree, these are helpful also when thinking about legal organizing or legal work. So first step is thinking about the life and scope. Does the work seek to make the PIC a less workable solution of problems and limit its reach over our lives? Second is think about where you're working. Is the, literally the site you're working at doing the most to take a chunk out of the PIC? Are you working at the sites that are most harmful that you have reach, where you have reach? Coalitions are key. I think multiple times we've mentioned really making sure that we're working in coalitions, either with explicitly abolitionist goals or pushing forward abolition and helping coalition members to understand abolition as you move the work forward. I think connected to the where you're working, thinking about not in my backyard solutions. So not necessarily displacing your problem that you're fighting to another area. And there is making sure that the actual goal ideally is what we really want, which is you're trying to get people free, ideally. Are we trying to move towards meaningful safety, collective health, etc.? And I think this is probably going to be a struggle with attorneys, specifically the 6th step, which is thinking about the words being used. But I think that something that is just even the example of being clear about what you mean when we say prison industrial complex abolition, even if it's clarity to with organizers that you're working with. And I think that using language and using the framing, liberatory framing really, really helps in terms of thinking about the goal of where you're moving towards. And then last but not least, thinking about how what you're doing now makes openings so that you can do tomorrow what you couldn't do today. Short-term, long-term abolition vision.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Woods, and that insight. So as we move on, I want to talk to Carrington about the role of lawyers and how we and the role of jailhouse lawyers in pushing the abolitionist agenda. And so Carrington, we'll start with you. What do you see as the role of jailhouse lawyers in pushing an abolitionist agenda? And then I think the second question there is what can lawyers on the outside, or rather street lawyers, what is their role in supporting the work of jailhouse lawyers and folks organizing on the inside?
Okay. I would say that jailhouse lawyers, our role is to be like an underground railroad on the inside and to help people that are in there see the vision of abolishing the prison system step by step. And the way that we do that is by helping all of those that are in need of return to society, people that have cases that are winnable, that don't deserve to be in jail, filing class actions and everything that chips away at the system. I've seen examples of that through people that are pre-trial detainees that were held in prison and really didn't have no source of financial source to be able to afford an attorney. that's where jailhouse lawyers come in at. And jailhouse lawyers, being as though they're educated in the law, they make changes like file like lawsuits like for cruel and unusual punishment, medical neglect, all different type of issues, First Amendment, censorship lawsuits. It's a bunch of different issues though, but mainly I see the role in helping people return to society and helping people that don't know the law. Because a lot of jailhouse lawyers are people that have decades in prisons that really don't have hope of themselves getting out because they may have missed their legal deadline from the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act with the 1-year statute of limitation. So they dedicate their time to helping those that do have a chance of reaching out. And at the same time, jailhouse lawyers articulate their goals to lawyers on the outside, particularly activist lawyers, because you can't just deal with any type of lawyer in society because not all lawyers look at prisoners as being human beings. There's this view of people in prison that's even shared by lawyers. Not everybody, but it's a large class of lawyers and people in society that view prisoners as third and fourth class citizens. If Black people on the streets are not even treated as first class citizens, you can imagine people in prison. So attorneys on the outside, particularly activist lawyers, work to articulate the agendas and the complaints and the things that jailhouse lawyers want on the outside, and they articulate it in an authentic way by being officers of the court. It's not always what you know, but who you know, because jailhouse lawyers might be some of the brightest individuals in the world, but because they don't have the ability to be able to enter into political offices and courts and things of that nature, they need those on the outside to be their voice and to articulate their goals in a specific type of way, in an authentic way. Examples of that is Mumia Abu Jamal with the lawsuit that lawyers helped them with in getting the cure for hepatitis for people that were terminally ill, because prior to that, people on the inside who had hepatitis, they wouldn't give them hepatitis treatment until they were like suffering from like cirrhosis of the liver. So by being able to collaborate with attorneys, this was able to get some type of relief for the guys that are suffering from hepatitis. And a lot of them guys still are trying to get relief, but even though there was a class action, but that's one of the examples. Solitary confinement, like with Russell Schultz, Chetaweo, Major Tillery, and a few other guys that the Abolitionist Law Center helped them to get back into general population after serving decades in solitary confinement. Even like another role that attorneys on the outside play in making it inside out is by articulating the goals of prisoners that are going on strikes. That's another way to not abolish the prison system, but work towards that goal of abolishing it, because we know that everything is tied into finances. So the prison cannot operate without the prisoners being the workers or being the consumers. And one of the major goals of jailhouse lawyers and on people out here should be to abolish the taxation, that the tax money that rural counties receive by housing prisoners in their counties, because majority of the people in prison are taken from urban areas, and prisons are built in rural towns, and this money that's by them counting prisoners on their census and not doing nothing for those prisoners, they're taking members away from that community. And it's another form of like counting people as 3/5 of a man, like they did during slavery. They was able to receive money by counting the slaves as 3/5 of a person, but they wasn't doing none of that. None of that money was going to benefit the slaves. They do the same thing to the inmates. So one way of crippling this system would be for people from the cities to ask our state representatives to pass legislation that makes that money go back to the community where the prisoners was taken from. That's one of the ways that I see it.
Thank you so much for that. And like for those examples, I think for just for the second question or second series of questions, if you could just talk a bit about, you gave some examples of like ways that organizers or jailhouse lawyers and folks organized on the inside have like worked together to gain some wins. Could you also talk a bit about some of the challenges in folks working together and the lessons there? The challenges of like jailhouse lawyers and street lawyers working together, and street lawyers attempting to support the work of like folks organized on the inside, and what is and the lessons that you know about and have learned through that work.
Okay, let me think. Okay, one of the challenges that I seen in working with attorneys on the outside were that, for example, an attorney may have a good idea about doing something, but the law may not permit that attorney to do what he wants to do. Like in Pennsylvania, for instance, Pennsylvania prisoners don't have a right to have an attorney represent them at the parole board. So that's like a challenge, because it's more effective when you have a person who's considered as an officer of the court to present your version of the events to make sure that they're not being arbitrary and abusive of their power. So in my case, Brett Grote from the Abolition Law Center, he presented a memorandum on my behalf, but I'm pretty sure it would have been more effective if he was able to come to my hearing in person. And another thing is like being able to see eye to eye on certain issues, because jailhouse lawyers may see things one way based upon their experience on the inside, and then lawyers on the outside might see it a different way based upon their experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And so as we wrap up the conversation with Carrington, we'll navigate to Chris, who I think kind of going off of what Carrington spoke about, just like the lawyers on the outside not necessarily understanding or like actually following the leadership, but like jailhouse lawyers who are informed both by the law and their experiences. And so for you, Chris, the first question for you is if you could talk about some of the ways that lawyers are addressing kind of this contradiction of both being like, because we have been trained inside of the system and recognizing that some of the legitimacy comes from proximity to the system and knowledge of the system. And so oftentimes making it like a barrier or putting a slightly in tension with following the leadership and honoring like the strategy of jailhouse lawyers, of organizers who are engaged in the abolitionist practice. So how can like lawyers actually like model and like be in true practice while understanding like all the things that we've been taught or they've been taught?
Okay, so I'm from Amistad Law Project, which is an organization in Philly that represents people in prison, advocates for just criminal legal policies, and organizes against imprisonment and for alternative ways of dealing with harm. just for context. And I think that one big thing is that all of the folks at Amistad identify as like both like lawyers and legal workers and organizers. And we walk into spaces, some spaces like with that sort of like, I'm a lawyer, I'm a paralegal, like the sort of legitimacy that comes with that. And then other spaces we go into as organizers, depending on what makes sense and what we're doing there, who we're meeting with. We also really try and break down that dichotomy of like, we're lawyers and then we have these like clients, and instead try and build really deep relationships with the people that we work with in prison, and like recognize that those folks know best how to free themselves, and that they have agency, and that, in the best moments we can sort of present these like ideas about what we can maybe do in a given case, but that the people who should be deciding what makes the most sense are the people who are actually going to be impacted by those decisions, because they know best what sort of safety considerations there are, and also just like what is a win to them is maybe different than a win to us. Mm-hmm. We wanna settle. We want the whatever court to tell us that yes, you were right. But someone in prison might think that something else, that we, are kind of like, oh, that's not really like, oh, we're kind of like, we're like maybe conceding too much. Like, but if that is what that person wants, then that's what we should do, and that's what we do.
Thank you for that, Chris. And so for those examples, so now I just want to kind of talk a bit about your work, and if you could talk a bit about how y'all carry out the strategy and practices and values of like prison industrial complex abolition, both in like your trial work, in your policy work, and in your DA accountability work.
I think that one of the things that comes to mind, we had a juvenile lifer client who was being resentenced, and like in all of the sort of training that we have around how to prepare clients for allocution and like what that moment is going to be like, he actually has the opportunity to address the court and talk about the fact that he took someone's life and now wants to come home and should be home. Mm-hmm. And so I was really like, I really wanted to prepare him for that moment and sort of run through it and be like, oh, like this is what it's going to be like, and like, actually hear what he was going to say. And he was like, no, absolutely not. I want it to be genuine. Like I know what I want to say. I know the things I need to say. And it was difficult, but we trusted him to make that decision and to know that he was going to be able to do that and going to be able to do that effectively. And when it came down to it, his allocution was really beautiful, really heartfelt, and was incredibly genuine. And like he's now pro eligible because like in large part because of the way he was able to express himself in that moment. Other things, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, I think, so specifically just thinking about what does it look like for you to like honor and carry out an abolitionist like framework and strategy in trial work, in like policy work? So oftentimes we know that if we're organizing for a specific policy, and I think Rachel mentioned this too, but oftentimes we find ourselves in this like false dichotomy of like good versus bad prisoner, or trying to like, or have been like kind of conditioned to make compromises, right? That we then have to come undo so that we can win or make one small gain. Can you talk about, as a person who does, who both who does trial work, right? Who also does policy work, like what that has looked like for you in your practice.
So I think with like DA accountability stuff, when we were thinking through what it meant that we were going to have this progressive DA, and Larry Krasner, and like what he could actually do specifically for people who are serving life without parole, or as we call it, death by incarceration. And we were, at first thinking about juvenile life or resentencings, and trying to get some commitments from him that process of the juvenile life or resentencings would look very different than it had under Seth Williams. Under Seth Williams, people were like the offers that people were getting weren't really less than 35 to life, which is the numbers that are in the really stupid statute that the Pennsylvania legislature made in 2012 to comply with Miller. And so, one of the big things that we wanted was for those numbers to come down. We wanted there to be some different process of those numbers being offered to people. And one of the folks that we work with who has a son who was 18 at the time that he caught the second-degree murder charge that has him now serving life without parole, was kind of like, what about the other lifers? What about people who were over 18 or 18 or over? And we were kind of like, oh, yes, obviously we don't just want to be focusing on people who were under 18. Obviously, we do believe that all of these people should have the opportunity to come home and like shouldn't be in prison in the first place. And so that like led us to sort of think about like what a DA could do in situations where someone is serving life without parole. And so we pushed Larry Krasner to like expand on what is now the Conviction Integrity Unit, or have innocence claims, but also at people who've been excessively sentenced, which is a lot of people who are serving life without parole. A lot of cases get charged as first degree, second degree, when they could be third degree. And so that was a big thing that came just because this person was like, hey, also my son is a person who's serving life without parole and is also in this fight, is also in this struggle. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. I think I couldn't hear you for like a few seconds. Okay. So thank you for that, Chris. And I think like I have one more question for you. You spoke a bit about the work that you do to fight to address juvenile lifers, right? To fight for juvenile lifers, to fight with juvenile lifers. I'm sorry. And so just the last question I think is like, what made Amistad Law Project specifically approach abolition through juvenile life without parole sentencing, and how do you make sure that in that work you don't get caught up in the narrative that only folks convicted while juveniles deserve to be free? And you spoke a bit about that, but if you could go like deeper into that and what that has looked like.
In Pennsylvania, people get life without parole for being convicted of being involved in a murder. Like whether that's first degree, second degree, like those life without parole, that's your conviction. And the reason that we do work around life without parole specifically is because we know that in order to figure out how to abolish the prison industrial complex, that we have to figure out other ways of dealing with harm. And that is a process that is going to require us to look at the most serious and like the cases that people are kind of like, oh, but what about people who kill other people? Obviously, we have to keep those people locked away forever. I think also that the pain of people who have lost a loved one to violence, or people who have been harmed, that's really instrumentalized. And those people wanting justice of some kind is like really they're presented with the option of do you want to get this person like locked up or punished as much as possible, or do you want nothing? Like that's the that's the option that our criminal legal system really means this person is going to get as much punishment as possible. You know, with juvenile lifers in particular, you know, the U.S. Supreme Court has been very clear about the brain science, and that there's something about people under 18 that is different on like a neurobiological level. Like on the same hand, though, we know that nothing magical happens when someone turns 18, and that most of the people who are serving life without parole in Pennsylvania caught their charges when they were under 25, and like many of them were 18, 19, 20, 21. And so that same brain science like also applies to those people. At the same time, most of the people who are leaders in prison and who are, you know, who really provide a lot of stability and mentorship in prison are people who are serving life without parole. And, you know, looking at someone 20, 30, 40, 50 years into their sentence, it doesn't really matter whether they were a juvenile lifer or whether they were 25 when they went into prison. That person is an entirely different person than they were when they first went inside. And, you know, just by sheer luck, most of the humans that we work with inside are really, really, really brilliant, really, really thoughtful people who, you know, I think if people met them in any context other than like knowing that this person is serving life without parole, would want to live next door to them and would want to interact with them, would want them to be in their communities and helping kids and providing mentorship. So I think it's based mostly on like knowing people serving life without parole and being like, obviously, these people should not be in cages.
Right. Thank you for that, Chris, and for like just kind of like breaking down how y'all made that decision. And so now I just want to thank each of the panelists for so much insight and for sharing your expertise and brilliance with us. But want to open it up for like questions from the participants in the audience. And like folks can type your questions into the group chat, or you can take yourself off mute to ask questions. And then if you're on the phone, if you have a question, I think to get off of mute, you can press *6 and to unmute yourself. Okay. So folks don't have any questions just yet. There's a question from Noel for you, Chris, if you can see the chat box. I think it says, what about the pushback from Juanita Kidd Justice Center judges? So I'm sure you understand that context, and how, can you talk about how that has been difficult for you?
So a lot of the things that that DA Krasner has tried to do in Philly there's been a ton of pushback from judges who have sort of framed it as, now we have a DA who's like also a defense attorney, and so we just have two defense attorneys in the courtroom. There's been some like pretty bizarre situations as like a result of judges kind of being like really combative to the reforms that Krasner is trying to make. Specifically, the Conviction Integrity Unit, while it like really wants to be expansive and look at cases like really broadly, the fact is that judges are not going to, in most cases, when a defense attorney or when the defense and like when the prosecution walk in together and they're like, hey, we've realized that this case is really unjust. This conviction should be thrown out. There should be these other charges. There should be like this new sentence. A judge would be like, cool, I'll sign off on that and sentence this person to that. But in Philly, that is very much not what is happening right now. Judges are like really applying like a lot of scrutiny to these appeals and like what's going on. And, you know, unless things look really amazing and super strong, they're like, no, I don't want it. So that's not going to fly. Which is also part of the reason why we're a part of this thing called the Judge Accountability Table that was recently formed. That's aimed at judicial accountability, because the judges just really don't feel accountable to anyone, which we've seen like really clearly in cases of like Meek Mill with Judge Brinkley, who, by the way, also is the person that hears most of these old appeals. Like if someone's judge that they had during their trial isn't on the bench anymore, she hears most of them and just is like a really unpleasant human. But yeah, so that's kind of what's going on with judges in Philly.
Thank you for that, Chris. And we had another question from the chat, and I think this is for anyone. And this is from Matthew. How do you look at electoral work for more progressive DAs? And so we put that in quotes, right? In an abolitionist framework. And so this is for anybody. Yeah. So Rachel Woods, Carrington.
I'm interested to hear what Chris has to say about that. I mean, I think there's been so much hope for Philly, you know, and it's like, oh, everything's going to change now. And, you know, I'm suspicious of that before I even heard all of this mess with the judges, which I should have anticipated, right? Had I been thinking carefully ahead a step. But, you know, I tend to be suspicious of that because I'm like, do we really want to be, you know, pushing hard to hire prosecutors, right, for this position? This position is a prosecutorial position, regardless of who holds it, right? And, you know, I live in the Bay Area and definitely have seen the impacts of having a, you know, more progressive DA in San Francisco, for instance. It means that some people just don't ever get arrested for some stuff, right? So I see that. But I guess I'm really interested in understanding, you know, like maybe from Chris's perspective, how does that look, you know, in practice? And do you think that it is any kind of step toward abolitionist ends to do that? I'm open to that idea. I think I just need to know more about kind of what it's like to live with so-called progressive DA and understand what's possible there.
I definitely think a quote-unquote progressive DA helps people. Like, you know, just like on like a really, like the juvenile lifer offers that people are getting have gone way down from 35 to life, which is, you know, pretty much entirely because of Larry Krasner. But, you know, he is obviously still a prosecutor. As you know, those 30 years that he has of being a defense attorney don't mean that now his job is not to put people in prison. And so it's certainly not something that's like abolitionist, you know, like it's something that we're like, yes, we want this because it's going to help some of our folks. But not something that we're like, we want this because it's actually going to like get us where we want to be, like ultimately. And like, I feel like, you know, a lot of times we end up sort of holding those contradictions and like having to both be like, yes, we want this prosecutor instead of like a worse prosecutor. But also are like, but also like we want a different system. Like we don't want there to be prosecutors. And so I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, thank you. I wish we had more time because I just want to hear more about this, like our relationship, folks' relationships and reliance on court systems, and what it means for like lawyers to be dismantling these like specifically court systems, while also like being like slightly invested and like trained around navigating it. But we can save that. So we have three more questions, and I think we got 5 more minutes. So I just want to like name, we're going to close out questions here. But The first one I think we'll get to is like from Peter, who says, I heard Marian Kaba on the Justice in America podcast recently put forth an idea that I thought was powerful. And basically she says, like so many of her other ideas. And so Mariam Kaba said something along the lines that we aren't obligated to provide solutions to justify our position. Justify our position, and that the system and the injustices it perpetuates were put together over a long time by many different entities. So one can validly critique that system without having answers to every concern about what abolition might mean. And Peter's interested in the panelists' thoughts. And so Peter says that Peter personally agrees, but also think that when we can't answer difficult questions, it makes it hard to win certain people over to ideas. And so I'm going to push that back to the panelists to kind of provide your thoughts on not necessarily having solutions to every critique.
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind starting that one. This is Rachel. Yeah, you know, that one's a tough one, and I tend to agree with Miriam. I tend to agree with Miriam a lot. But I think on this one, I do agree. I have maybe a slightly different take on it, which is that I think we don't have to wait. You know, I think there's this idea that we have to wait until we have a perfect blueprint before we can be critical of the existing system, or until we can advocate for abolitionist ends. And I don't think that's true. I think we have to have some ideas that we have to try. And, you know, I would agree that I think if we aren't willing to engage in difficult questions, that can be really alienating to people. I think we need to take people's real world concerns seriously. And I think, you know, the prison industrial complex is really what it's perfected maybe most is the ideology of it, right? So we've been convinced through socialization that we should be afraid of certain kind of people, that the only appropriate remedy is a cop or a cage, that we should be vengeful, right? All of these get permeate through a lot of different parts of our culture, whether that's religion or whether that's history or whether that's, you know, pop culture. And I think it comes to us lots of different ways. So I would agree with her in that regard. That, you know, we have a lot to be up against, and a system that has been amassed over a lot of time with a lot of resources and a lot of space to create itself. I think that we are perfectly justified in speaking against something that's killing us. That's absolutely true. And I think it's not responsible for people to say, well, you know, you can't tell me exactly what to do right now instead of that, so your idea is stupid, right? But I also think we have to be practicing. We have to put some stuff to work, right? Mm-hmm. So I can say, I think it's more harmful to call a cop than to not call a cop. And that doesn't mean that I can tell you precisely what to do right now in your situation, your geographical space, to say what's going to work perfectly for you. But I can say, okay, what I would encourage you to do is think about who's around you who's not a cop, who might be able to do some of the same things, whether that's de-escalate or interrupt a situation of harm, whether that's help provide you with care or comfort, right? And if that doesn't work 100% for you, then I don't think it's that, you know, alternatives to calling the cops don't work or that abolition's a bust. And we've been seeing that recently, for instance, around R. Kelly or Michael Jackson, right? That's like, because, you know, these people did so much harm over so much time, that, you know, abolition is a useless thing to be offering because it didn't stop R. Kelly or whomever, right, from doing harm. And, you know, that's probably, they should have been stopped from doing harm, yes. But I would bet a lot of money I don't have, that people were not given the same opportunities to really try over a long period of time with legitimate support and credibility, things that were not criminal legal remedies, right? Or that they even came into the realm. So we don't have any sense that something other than criminal legal remedies were tried. So to act as if they're not valuable or viable, I think I think it's lazy thinking. I think it's not rigorous thinking to do that. And so I don't think we have to have a perfect thing, but I think we have to have something that we can start trying. I think that's important. Sorry to go on about that. That's been on my mind a little bit.
No, thank you so much for that. That's super helpful. And the second question we have is for you, Rachel, again. If you could further elaborate, and this is from Kendall, if you could further elaborate on the harm of drawing a direct link from the fight to abolish chattel slavery to the fight to abolish the prison industrial complex, / what present day distinctions are important to understand.
Okay. So I probably overstated that, Kendall. I'm sorry. I don't think it's harmful to do it. I just don't think it's accurate to do it. I think that there are distinctions to the system of chattel slavery, to the system of imprisonment. And there might be, pieces of those histories that you could do a connect the dots to. What I'm saying is I don't think it's a single, thread, right? So I think that some of the distinctions are that, even while you lose liberty when you are living in a cage, you lose a good portion of your ability to operate under your own steam, to be an autonomous person, and the system would like you to lose a lot of your humanity. That is still a different system from being a not full human being who can be bought and sold. There are distinctions there. There are distinctions to the kind of labor people are put to and the conditions under which they operate, even though many people working inside of prisons, many of whom are working in the service of their own imprisonment, right? Whether that's mopping floors or that's doing the laundry or whatever it might be. Those are terrible conditions. Most people are not working, endless days under the lash of a whip, and, at peril of death at any moment if they disobey. And so I think, I'm not trying to say there aren't really close parallels, and I'm not trying to say we don't learn a lot from the fight against chattel slavery. But what I'm trying to say is I think people are constantly trying to say imprisonment is the new whatever, right? Our current system is the new whatever. And I think what's more useful for us to do is to learn lessons from history, to think about what we can pull ahead from movements that really helps us fight better, but also to take care to think about what are the current issues that we're facing, what's in our material conditions in real time, and what do we need to win in those conditions, and not necessarily to say X is the same as Y. So I'm not trying to say it's harmful to say that. I just think my sense is that it's more complicated than that, and that more rigorous thinking might help us organize better.
Thank you. And then the last question we'll take for the night is, how do we consolidate wins like Governor Newsom halting executions, but then he also works hard to stop parole, which is a loss? And anybody can answer that. Any of the panelists, feel free to jump in.
I'm going to say a thing, LOL. I think that one thing that we have to be really careful of is recognizing that that politicians at times are our allies, and at times we do things, they do things that we want them to do, but that we don't have to go around talking about all the good things that they do, and that we pretty much always have to be critical of them, especially when they're doing things that we don't want them to do. I think we can really easily be oh my goodness, they did this one good thing, so now for the rest of our lives we have to talk about how great that was. And it's like, no, we actually have to make them do that more. And so that's not going to involve us just like talking about how great they are forever. So yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Does anybody else want to answer y'all before we hop?
Sure. I mean, I think that also continuing to ground it in a critique of overall what's happening in the prison industrial complex in California too, right? So it's like, how do we move from those positions of the wins to further fight against the losses, right? And how do we take maybe some of the organizers or the people who held key relationships in mobilizing those wins and organize to pressure Governor Newsom to actually like release people. So it's kind of I think it is I think to answer the question around consolidating a win is like you take what you were able to gain and then mobilize it in service of moving abolition forward long term.
Yeah, I hear that. So y'all, thank y'all so much for this extremely powerful and rich discussion on abolition. I feel like I took away so much, and it's super helpful in like both the organizing work we do and like I think the legal and policy support we hope to do with organizers. So again, thank you to our amazing panelists, Rachel, Chris, Carrington Woods, and shout out to Critical Resistance for both being like a leader in this work, and also for like collaborating with us on this webinar. And so as we wrap up, I just want to remind folks that this is kind of the second in our series, in our political education series. And so please be on the lookout for more information about our anti-capitalism webinar in April. But mad love to y'all. Thank you so much. I hope folks have a good night. And I think also we posted in the chat a little while ago, some readings for folks to look at while they're to deepen their study. And so I posted again just for folks who didn't see it, but there are a list of beautiful readings by like some amazing thought leaders in this work that you can look to. But okay, y'all, have a beautiful night. Peace.